It was a typical Wednesday evening when I stumbled upon the truth, and it came crashing down like a wave, drowning me in a sea of betrayal. I had just finished work, the fluorescent lights of the office still flickering in my mind as I walked through the front door of our apartment. The smell of something sweet wafted through the air, a stark contrast to the bitterness that had settled deep in my gut. My wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot on the stove. The sight of her so domestic and serene should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a prelude to a tragedy. I tossed my keys onto the counter and called out to her, "Hey, I'm home." My voice echoed in the small space, but there was no response. I shrugged it off, dismissing the oddity of her silence. After all, she must have been caught up in her cooking, lost in her own world. I walked over to the living room, expecting to find her there, but instead, I was met with a sight that would haunt me forever. Through the slightly ajar door of our bedroom, I heard laughter. His laugh. It was unmistakable. Eric, our landlord, had been a fixture in our lives for years. He had always been the friendly neighbor, the helpful hand when we needed repairs. But now that laughter twisted in my stomach like a knife. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I needed to know. Peering through the crack in the door, I saw them. Sarah was sitting on the edge of our bed, her hair cascading over her shoulders, a smile playing on her lips as she leaned toward Eric, who stood too close for comfort. The way she looked at him, the light in her eyes, it was a look I hadn't seen directed at me in months, maybe years. It was a look of desire, of intimacy, and it shattered me. Time seemed to freeze as my mind raced. I felt a swell of nausea rise in my throat. How could she? How could she betray me, us, in our own home with the very man we trusted? I stepped back, my breath coming in short gasps. The emotional turmoil was overwhelming. Anger, humiliation, confusion, all swirling around in a chaotic storm. I felt like a ghost in my own life, invisible and powerless. The reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. I had built a life with Sarah, shared dreams and plans, and now it was all crumbling to dust. I wanted to confront them right there, to burst through that door and demand answers, but a part of me hesitated. Instead, I retreated to the living room, packing back and forth, grappling with the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume me. I felt like a fool, betrayed not just by my wife, but by a man I had once considered a friend. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just physical, or had they shared something deeper? The uncertainty gnawed at me, amplifying the pain that was already taking root. I knew I had to make a choice. I could either confront Sarah and Eric immediately, or I could bide my time, gather my thoughts, and plan my next move. As the anger simmered beneath the surface, I felt a dark satisfaction creeping into my mind. I wanted revenge. I wanted Eric to regret ever laying a hand on my wife. But how? The thought of plotting against them filled me with a strange sense of purpose. I had always been the passive one, the peacemaker, but now I was filled with a burning desire to reclaim my dignity. I began to envision a plan, a way to ensure that Eric would understand the consequences of his actions. I couldn't let Sarah's betrayal go unpunished, not just for my own sake, but for the sanctity of our marriage, the trust that had been shattered. I felt the gears in my mind start to turn, the anger coiling around my thoughts like a snake ready to strike. As I stood there, contemplating the darkness that lay ahead, I realized that this was only the beginning. The emotional turmoil, the betrayal, and the revenge, it would all come to a head, and I was ready to embrace it. In the days that followed my discovery, the world around me became a blur, an indistinct canvas painted in shades of gray. I went through the motions of life, but my mind was a battlefield. I kept replaying that moment in the bedroom, the laughter echoing in my head. Like an ominous refrain, the warmth of our home had turned cold, and every corner reminded me of her betrayal. I felt like a stranger in my own life, a man wrestling with his demons. The anger I felt toward Sarah was palpable, but it was nothing compared to the rage I directed at Eric. He was the one who had crossed the line, the one who had taken advantage of our trust. I kept asking myself how he could do this. Did he think of me as a fool? Or worse, Did he think of me as someone who wouldn't fight back? A part of me wanted to confront him, to shout at him, to make him feel the weight of what he had done. But another part of me knew that brute force wouldn't suffice. I needed to be strategic. I couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that clung to me like a second skin. The thought of Sarah laughing and flirting with Eric in our home made my blood boil. I had been the one to provide for us, to build a life for us, and yet here she was, giving herself to another man. What was wrong with me? Had I failed her in some way? The questions spiraled, each one more painful than the last. But I knew I had to channel this pain, this betrayal, into something constructive. Revenge was not just an impulse. It was a necessity. I had to make Eric regret ever laying a hand on my wife. I had to show him that there were consequences to his actions, that he couldn't just waltz into my life and take what was mine. As I sat alone in our dimly lit living room, I began to draft my plan. I envisioned Eric's face when he realized that his actions had repercussions. I wanted him to understand that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I wanted him to feel the weight of his betrayal just as I felt it. First, I needed to gather information. I had to know everything about Eric, his routines, his weaknesses, anything that I could exploit. I decided to stake out the building, to watch him from a distance. It felt strange, like I was becoming something I had never been, a hunter. But I had to do it. I had to know my enemy. The next day, I found a spot across the street from our apartment complex, hidden behind a row of trees. As I waited, I watched the comings and goings of tenants, trying to pinpoint Eric's schedule. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I spotted him leaving his apartment. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, looking every bit the charming landlord. I could see why Sarah had been drawn to him. He had an air of confidence that was hard to resist. But that only fueled my anger. How could she choose him over me? As the days turned into a week, I gathered more intel. I learned that Eric often went to the local bar after work, where he liked to unwind with a few drinks. I also discovered that he had a penchant for gambling, a weakness that I could exploit. The thought of using his own vices against him filled me with a sense of power. I could turn the tables. I could make him feel the same helplessness I felt. I began to formulate a plan that would ensure Eric would regret his actions. I would set him up in a way that would expose his weaknesses, humiliate him, and make him understand the consequences of his betrayal. I envisioned a scenario where he would lose not just money but also his reputation. It was dark, but I reveled in the thought of it. As I sat there plotting, I felt a shift within me. The pain of betrayal was still there, but it was beginning to transform into something else: determination. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of my own revenge. I would take back control of my life, and I would make sure Eric understood that he could not take what was mine without facing the consequences. But there was still Sarah. I couldn't ignore her completely. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, to hear her side of the story. But I knew that would only complicate things. For now, I needed to stay focused on my plan. I had to ensure that Eric felt the weight of his actions before I dealt with Sarah. The more I thought about it, the clearer my path became. I would strike when the time was right, when Eric least expected it. The thought of his shock, his realization that he had messed with the wrong man, filled me with a sense of satisfaction. I was ready to embrace the darkness, to become the agent of my own fate. With every passing day, my resolve grew stronger. I was no longer just a husband betrayed. I was a man on a mission. And soon, Eric would learn that actions have consequences. The days turned into a blur of meticulous planning. I felt like a general preparing for battle, every detail crucial to my strategy. The more I delved into Eric's life, the more I learned about his vulnerabilities. I had already observed his gambling habits. He frequented a bar known for its poker nights. It was a popular spot among locals, and I could easily blend in without drawing attention to myself. I decided that my first step would be to ingratiate myself with the regulars at the bar. I needed to gather intel, to learn about Eric's reputation, and to understand the dynamics of the poker games he frequented. I had no experience in gambling, but I was willing to learn. The idea of putting Eric in a position where he could lose everything was intoxicating. I started going to the bar every evening after work, sitting at a corner table with a drink in hand. I observed the interactions, the small talk, and the subtle alliances that formed between players. I introduced myself as a newcomer, someone looking to learn the ropes. Gradually, I was welcomed into their fold, and I made sure to keep my true motives hidden. As the weeks went by, I became a familiar face. I struck up conversations with the regulars, sharing stories and laughs. I learned about their lives, their struggles, and their dreams, but my focus remained on Eric. I listened intently whenever someone mentioned him, taking mental notes of every detail. It turned out Eric was well-liked, but there were whispers of his gambling habits, how he often played beyond his means, driven by a need to prove himself. One night, I overheard a group discussing an upcoming poker tournament at the bar. The stakes would be higher than usual, and the atmosphere would be electric. I realized this was the perfect opportunity to execute my plan. If I could get Eric to enter the tournament, I could manipulate the situation to ensure he lost big. I approached one of the regulars, a man named Frank who had a reputation for being a skilled player. I struck up a friendship with him, sharing my own fabricated love for poker. I casually mentioned how I had heard about the tournament and how I was considering entering. Frank's eyes lit up as he explained the rules and the thrill of the game. I could see the excitement in his demeanor, and I knew I had found my ally. Over the next few days, I continued to play the game, both at the bar and in the shadows. I learned the intricacies of poker, the psychology behind it, and the importance of reading your opponents. While I practiced, I also kept an eye on Eric, waiting for the right moment to set my plan in motion. I finally approached Frank with a proposal. I wanted to challenge Eric to a friendly game of poker one night, just the three of us. I knew that if I could get him to play, I could heighten the stakes and create a situation where he would be pressured to bet more than he could afford. Frank agreed, seeing it as a chance to showcase his skills against the landlord. As I prepared for the game, I also started gathering information about Eric's financial situation. I learned that he had a mortgage on his property and that he often struggled to keep up with payments due to his gambling habits. This knowledge fueled my determination. I could use it against him. I could take everything he held dear, just as he had taken my wife. The night of the poker game arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves mixed with anticipation. I dressed sharply, wanting to project a sense of confidence that I was still working to feel. I arrived at the bar early, setting up the table and ensuring everything was in place. Frank arrived shortly after and we shared a few laughs, keeping the atmosphere light. Then Eric walked in, his usual charming self, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. He greeted us with a smile, and I could see the glint of confidence in his eyes. He was ready to play, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. As we settled into the game, I kept my demeanor relaxed, masking the tension that was building inside me. The initial rounds were friendly, laughter filling the air as we shared stories. But as the stakes rose, I could see the shift in Eric's demeanor. His competitive nature emerged, and I watched as he began to take risks, pushing the limits of his bankroll. With every hand, I could sense him becoming more desperate. I played my cards close to my chest, allowing him to believe he had the upper hand. I could see the tension in his face, the flicker of fear when he realized he might lose more than just a game. I knew I was close to pushing him over the edge. As the game progressed, I began to drop hints about my own financial stability, weaving a narrative that implied I was doing well and could afford to take risks. I watched as Eric's confidence wavered, and I could feel the anticipation of his impending downfall. I had him right where I wanted him. The game was nearing its climax, and I could almost taste the sweet satisfaction of revenge. All I needed was one final push to ensure Eric would understand the consequences of his actions, not just for himself but for Sarah as well. In that moment, I realized that my plan was more than just revenge. It was about reclaiming my own sense of power, about turning the tables on the man who had taken so much from me. I was ready to execute the final act of my carefully crafted revenge. The atmosphere in the bar crackled with tension as the final hands of the poker game unfolded. I could see the sweat beading on Eric's forehead, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. The stakes had escalated to a point where he was no longer just playing for money. He was playing for his pride, for his reputation, and perhaps even for his future. I could sense his desperation, and it filled me with a dark sense of satisfaction. "All right, gentlemen," I said, leaning back in my chair. "How about we make this interesting? A little wager on the side." I could see Eric's eyes narrow, the challenge sparking his competitive spirit. "Let's say the loser pays for dinner at the new steakhouse downtown. And I mean a nice dinner, nothing but the best." Eric smirked, the bravado returning to his expression. "You're on, but let's raise the stakes a bit more. How about the loser pays the winner's rent for a month?" The proposition hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I nodded, a calculated smile creeping onto my face. "You're on." As the cards were dealt for the final round, I could feel my heart racing. Every instinct told me this was it, the climax of my revenge. I had been building toward this moment for weeks, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. I focused on my cards, trying to maintain an air of calm while the storm raged inside me. Eric, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves. He glanced at his cards, then back at me, his mind racing. I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head as he weighed his options. The tension was palpable, and Frank, sensing the gravity of the moment, leaned back in his chair, watching with a mix of excitement and apprehension. As the round progressed, I played my hand strategically, allowing Eric to build his confidence. I watched as he bet, more aggressively, pushing his chips to the center of the table with a sense of bravado that felt desperate. The stakes were getting higher, and I could see the flicker of fear in his eyes as he realized he was in over his head. Finally, it was time to reveal our hands. I laid down my cards, three of a kind, a solid hand that would secure my victory. Eric hesitated, his confidence faltering as he revealed his own hand, two pair. The realization hit him like a freight train, his face draining of color. I can't believe this," he stammered, the bravado melting away. "I thought I had you." "You should have known better than to underestimate me," I said, my voice steady, but inside I was a whirlwind of emotions. The thrill of victory mingled with the darker satisfaction of revenge. "You just lost a month's rent, Eric. That's going to sting." He sat there, disbelief etched across his features. The reality of his loss began to sink in, and I could see the anger brewing beneath the surface. "You cheated," he accused, his voice rising. "You had to have cheated, no way you could win like that." I leaned closer, maintaining eye contact, letting the tension simmer. "You can believe what you want, Eric, but the fact is you lost, and now you'll have to face the consequences." As he fumed, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about the game anymore. It was about power, about reclaiming what he had taken from me. I wasn't just a victim, I was a force to be reckoned with. Then a thought struck me. I decided to take this moment further to ensure that Eric understood the gravity of his actions. "You know, Eric," I said, my voice low and deliberate, "this isn't just about the game, it's about what you did to my wife. You think you can just waltz into my life and take what's mine without repercussions?" His expression shifted, a mixture of fear and anger crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" I leaned back, crossing my arms. "You know exactly what I mean. You think this is just a game. You've taken something from me that I can never get back, and now you're going to pay for it." The realization washed over him, and I could see the panic in his eyes. He understood that this was more than just a poker game, it was a reckoning. I watched as he struggled to find words, his bravado crumbling under the weight of my accusation. "You're out of your mind," he finally spat, but I could see the tremor in his voice. "You can't do this." "Watch me," I said, my voice steady. "You've made your choices, Eric. You've crossed a line, and now it's time to face the consequences. I'll make sure Sarah knows exactly what you've done. You think you can just take her from me and walk away unscathed? Think again." With that, I stood up, leaving him to grapple with the fallout of our game. I felt a rush of adrenaline, a mix of triumph and anger. I had executed my plan, and I had made my point. Eric would think twice before crossing me again. As I walked out of the bar, I felt a sense of clarity. I had taken back control, but the confrontation with Sarah loomed ahead. I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. I had to face her and confront the reality of our shattered relationship. The night air hit me like a cold slap, but I welcomed it. I was ready for whatever came next. I had set my revenge in motion, and now it was time to deal with the aftermath. The atmosphere at home was suffocating. I stepped through the door, the silence echoing around me like a ghostly reminder of what had transpired. I had just executed my plan against Eric, and while the thrill of revenge was still coursing through my veins, a new dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I had no idea how Sarah would react when she learned the truth about her lover's downfall. I found her in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. The sight of her, so innocent and unaware, made my heart ache. I had loved this woman, built a life with her, and yet here we were, standing on the precipice of destruction. The weight of my actions pressed heavily on my chest, but I reminded myself that I was doing this for my own dignity, for the respect that Eric had stolen from me. "Hey," I said, forcing a casual tone as I entered the room. She looked up, her eyes brightening momentarily before a shadow passed over her face. "How was your day?" "Fine," she replied, her voice flat. "Just reading. How about you?" I hesitated, the tension in the air thickening. "I had a poker game with Eric tonight." Her expression shifted, curiosity mingling with concern. "Oh, how did it go?" I took a deep breath, knowing I had to tread carefully. "I won. Big." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but it quickly faded into something more guarded. "That's great, I guess." "Yeah, well, it was more than just a game," I said, my heart racing. "We made a wager." "What kind of wager?" she asked, her brow furrowing. I decided to plunge ahead. "I made him pay for his actions. He lost a month's rent to me." Her eyes widened, and I saw the realization hit her like a slap. "What do you mean?" I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms defensively. "He's been cheating on you, Sarah. I know everything. I saw you together, you think." I wouldn't find out. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face paled, and I could see the gears turning in her mind as she processed my words. You saw us." "Yes," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "And I made sure Eric understood the consequences of what he did. I made him pay." She stood up, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "You can't just do that. You don't know what was happening between us." "Don't I?" I shot back, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You think I don't know betrayal when I see it? You think I would just sit back and let him take you away from me? Who do you think you are?" she yelled, her voice cracking. "You think this is going to fix anything? You think this is going to make me love you again?" Her words cut deep, and I felt the sting of her rejection. "I'm not trying to win you back, Sarah. I'm trying to protect what's mine. Protect what's yours." She scoffed, her eyes blazing. "You think you can just control me? You think you can scare Eric into submission and that will somehow make this right?" I felt a surge of frustration. "I'm not trying to control you, I'm trying to make a point. This isn't just about us anymore, it's about respect. It's about standing up for myself after everything he's done." "Standing up for yourself," she echoed, her voice rising. "By threatening my lover, by ruining his life. You think that's going to help our marriage?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I could see the pain in her eyes, the realization that our relationship was hanging by a thread. The anger and betrayal had created a chasm between us, one that felt insurmountable. "Maybe I should have never trusted you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I was a fool to think we could work through this. Maybe you should have just talked to me instead of plotting revenge," she shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. "You think this is going to solve anything? You think I'm going to just forget what happened because you played a game?" I felt the weight of my actions crashing down on me. The satisfaction I had felt earlier began to dissipate, replaced by a gnawing sense of regret. I thought if I made him pay, it would make things right. "But it doesn't, does it?" she said, her voice softening slightly. "You can't fix this with revenge, and you can't fix this by trying to control me or him. You have to face the truth of what happened between us." As her words sank in, I felt the anger drain from my body, leaving behind a hollow ache. I had been so consumed by my need for revenge that I had lost sight of the bigger picture. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," she admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know if we can come back from this. You've made a choice, and I don't know if I can forgive you for it." The weight of her words settled heavily on my shoulders. I had sought to reclaim my power, but in doing so I had pushed her further away. The consequences of my actions were unfolding before me, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "Maybe I was wrong," I said, my voice cracking. "Maybe I thought revenge would bring me peace, but all it's done is push you away." Sarah looked at me, her expression a mix of sadness and disappointment. "We need to figure this out, together, but right now I don't know if I can be here with you." With that, she turned away, leaving me standing alone in the living room, the silence closing in around me. I felt like I was losing everything, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had sought revenge, but in the end, all I had done was deepen the rift between us. As I stood there, grappling with the consequences of my choices, I realized that the path ahead would be far more difficult than I had anticipated. Revenge had not brought me peace. It had only led to more pain. I had to confront the reality of my actions and decide what I truly wanted. Did I want to fight for our marriage, or had I already lost her for good? The days that followed our confrontation were an emotional roller coaster. Sarah and I moved like ghosts in our own home, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. I could feel the distance growing between us, like an ever-widening chasm that threatened to swallow our relationship whole. I spent my nights replaying our argument in my mind, questioning every decision I had made, every move I had plotted. I had sought revenge against Eric, believing it would restore my dignity and perhaps even my marriage. Instead, it had only deepened the wounds. I realized that my actions had been driven by anger and betrayal, but they had also been a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of control in a world that felt utterly chaotic. I had taken a gamble of my own, and now I was left with the consequences. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I picked up my phone and stared at it, contemplating whether to reach out to Sarah. I wanted to apologize, to express the regret that had been festering inside me. But what could I say? How could I explain that my need for revenge had blinded me to the truth? After a long internal battle, I finally decided to send her a message. "Can we talk? I need to apologize for how I handled everything." I hit send, my heart racing as I waited for her response. The minutes stretched into eternity, and just when I thought she might ignore me, my phone buzzed. "Okay, when?" I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. This was my chance to confront the reality of our situation, to lay everything bare. I suggested we meet at a nearby coffee shop, a neutral ground where we could speak openly without the weight of our home pressing down on us. As I arrived at the shop, I felt a knot of apprehension in my stomach. I knew that this conversation could determine the future of our relationship. When Sarah walked in, her expression was guarded, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. I gestured for her to sit, feeling the tension radiate between us. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice steady but laced with emotion. "I know things have been hard between us, and I want to start by saying I'm sorry. I acted out of anger, and I let my need for revenge blind me to what really mattered." She looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "You hurt me, and you hurt Eric. I don't know if what you did was justified. I understand you felt betrayed, but revenge isn't love. It's destruction." "I know," I admitted, my voice heavy with regret. "I thought I could reclaim my dignity by making him pay, but all I did was push you away. I see that now. I've lost sight of what really matters us." Her gaze met mine, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you. It's going to take time for me to process everything that's happened." "I understand," I said, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild what we had. I want to be better for you and for us." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our conversation hanging in the air. "What if I told you I did want to continue this relationship?" She finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words struck me like a blow. I felt my heart sink, the realization hitting me hard. "If that's what you want, I'll respect your decision. But I want you to know that I still love you, and I'm willing to fight for us." Tears welled in her eyes, and she wiped them away angrily. "I still care about you too, but I don't know if love is enough anymore. You took something from me, and I'm not sure if I can ever trust you again." I nodded, my heart heavy. I can't change the past, but I can show you that I'm committed to making things right. I'll give you the space you need, but I hope we can work through this together. As we parted ways that day, I felt a mix of hope and despair. I had taken the first step toward reconciliation, but the road ahead was uncertain. I knew that rebuilding trust would take time, and I was prepared for the long journey ahead. In the weeks that followed, I focused on self-reflection. I sought counseling not just for myself, but also for our relationship. I wanted to understand why I had reacted the way I did, why my need for revenge had overshadowed my love for Sarah. I realized that my actions had been a reflection of my own insecurities and fears, and I was determined to confront those demons. As I worked on myself, I also reached out to Sarah, giving her the space she needed while letting her know that I was there for her. I sent her messages of support, reminding her that she was still loved, no matter what happened between us. Slowly, our communication began to improve. We met occasionally, discussing our feelings and the possibility of rebuilding our relationship. It was a fragile process, filled with moments of doubt and uncertainty, but it was also filled with hope. We were learning to navigate the complexities of love and betrayal, and I was committed to showing her that I could be the partner she deserved. In the end, I realized that revenge had not brought me the peace I sought. Instead, it had opened my eyes to the deeper issues within myself and our relationship. I had learned that love was not about control or retaliation. It was about understanding, forgiveness, and the willingness to grow together. As I stood at the crossroads of my life, I knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time. Love, after all, was worth fighting for, even in the wake of betrayal. I had learned my lesson. Revenge may have felt sweet for a moment, but true peace came from healing and rebuilding what was broken. Whether Sarah and I could find our way back to each other remained to be seen, but I was willing to try. In that moment of clarity, I understood that the real battle was not against Eric or the betrayal, but within myself. And that was the fight I was determined to win.